Hi everyone, I'm Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. I've been doing consular law for many years, and this has really come into the limelight now recently with something called the national interest exception. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The point of this video is to guide you if you are outside the United States and you have a current visa or you're an ESTA eligible national from one of the 38 ESTA countries and you're interested in coming to the United States directly. So let's talk about the national interest exception. This is something that went into effect on July 15th, and it applies to specific travelers from the Schengen-area countries, which is essentially all the contiguous countries within the EU, as well as the UK, Ireland, Iran, China, and Brazil. What does that mean? That means if you're living in one of those countries right now, if you're physically in one of those countries and you have a visa or you're part of the visa waiver program and your ESTA is active, you can apply for a national interest exception through one of the US embassies or consulates in your home country. And that will allow you, once it's given to you, to enter the United States directly via a flight into one of the 15 airports that are now taking foreign national flights. So you need to make sure that you're flying into one of those countries. There are certain visa categories that are allowed to be processed, and that is F1 and M1 students. So that's academic students or vocational students, the researchers that are part of specific J1 programs that probably has to do something with health or with healthcare, investors, which are E2 visa holders, and then business travelers, so that corresponds to the B1 category, and as well as I mentioned ESTA holders, but you need to make sure that you're qualifying under the specific criteria of the exceptions. Let's talk about how this works. B1 business visitors that might be eligible for what's called the NIE, the National Interest Exception, are technical experts and specialists who are going to the US to install, service, maintain, or receive training for vessels, machinery, and other specialized equipment. So that's equipment that's used by US or foreign firms in the US who are substantially invested in the United States, and that really corresponds to L1B positions. So if you have applied for an L1 visa in the US, but you can't get your visa until the end of the year, and we'll talk about that, then you may be able to qualify under this specific exception if you're working for the foreign company and you're coming into the United States to train individuals or to install or service or maintain very specialized equipment. Another category that is eligible for the NIE is senior level managers and executives, as well as their dependents. So when you're applying for the exception, if you have a spouse and or children that are under 21, you want to make sure that you're applying together for this. And these are people who provide strategic direction necessary for the success of a company or a specific venture. So that corresponds to the L1A category. It may also correspond to B1 business visitors. So if you don't have those visas yet and you can't get them now between now and the end of the year because of a separate executive order, then you can apply for a B1 business visitor exception. So that means that you already need to have the B1 visa stamped into your passport. Another exception is the P1, which is for professional athletes, which really doesn't come into play that often. That exception has been in place since the beginning of these proclamations. The next one, which is very important, is E1 or E2. So we're talking about treaty trade or treaty investors that are applying for visas. The good news is that a lot of the US embassies and consulates are now starting to process E1s and E2s again. And E2 specifically has a very good starting point because you have to show that you are investing substantially, which means at least enough to cover 1 year of operating costs. But you also have to pass what's called the marginality test, which shows that not just you and your family members or the immediate people who are applying will be benefiting from the visa, which means job creation for the US, which then also meets the requirement for the national interest exception, which is having a substantial impact on the economy of the United States. So since these two things overlap very clearly, The embassies and consulates are now resuming processing of these visas. And it's important to keep in mind, and I'll reiterate this later, that each embassy and consulate has its own rules and regulations and operates essentially, they're their own island. And so they apply the law pretty much the same way, but you need to consult with each specific embassy or consulate to see if they're accepting these visa applications. If you already have these visas, then you can apply for the national interest exception. The last eligible categories I already mentioned were F1 and M1 students and J1 researchers. So if you're trying to come here for fall study, then you should be able to get an appointment for a visa if you don't have it. And if you already have the visas, you should be able to enter getting this exception. So everyone needs to remember that this is for people who want to fly directly to the United States from any of these countries that are now currently part of this bar for direct entry. What is the verification process here? So what happens if you're on ESTA? ESTA is part of the visa waiver program. It means if you're from one of 38 member countries, all you need to do is apply online through the ESTA website to get authorization to travel to the US without a visa for a period of up to 2 years total. And so what you need to do here is consult with the website for the specific embassy or consulate where you will be applying for the exception. Once you have the exception, you'll be able to use your ESTA without having to apply for a visa and to come into the US for up to 90 days at a time. How do you make this work for you? Well, the most important thing to keep in mind here is that you have to consult with the specific embassy or consulate where you're applying. Every place has its own rules and regulations, but all of them now should be equipped with a specific email address that allows you to apply. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a holistic determination. It's made on the totality of the circumstances or of the evidence that's presented, called the preponderance of the evidence. So can you show that your presence in the United States will create a positive and measurable impact on the economy? That's what matters most here. And so when you're making these requests, you want to do it by including a cover letter from your company in the United States that's already sponsoring you, and measuring the impact somehow, explaining how it is possible or how it is very probable that your presence will lead to supervision of employees, the hiring of new employees, the generation of new revenues, the completion of projects which require more jobs. The economic argument is what matters most here. How will this create jobs in the United States? You want to keep that in mind when you're putting this together, that you have essentially one chance to apply. And it's possible that you can be denied, and that won't mean that you get your visa revoked or your ESTA status revoked. But you want to make a good impression. I was on a panel recently with the US consulate in the Netherlands, and they said that once you have one exception that's approved, the chances of getting subsequent exceptions approved are much higher. What happens when you get this approval? Well, it's important to keep in mind that it is good for one entry and you must use it within 30 days. So if you don't have an exceptional need that's very soon and you can't document that, then it's better to wait until you really have that need. The estimate in terms of processing, and that varies by consular post, is somewhere between a week and 2 weeks. So you need to be ready to travel when you apply, because you can use it once. And then, as I said, when you leave the United States and you need to apply again, your chances of getting one should be higher. This is all for individuals who want to avoid triangulation. So triangulation means that if you are coming from one of these countries that I enumerated earlier and you don't have a national interest exception that's been granted to you by a consular post, then you need to go to a third country that's not part of this list and stay there for at least 14 days before you enter the United States, which can create a lot of additional costs for companies. So this is one cost-effective way of allowing you to enter the United States directly, but it needs to be done the right way. A few take-home lessons, and I'm always available for questions if you have them following this video. This is useful for people who don't want to bear the expense of triangulation. The application must be filed by an individual that is currently outside the United States. So if you're in the US, you're planning on going home and know that you'll need to come back soon, my advice is to prepare your email with all the attachments and the letter from the company before you leave, and then submit it once you're overseas in order for them to be able to adjudicate your request. H-1Bs, H-2Bs, J-1s, and L-1s are still on pause in terms of new visa issuance. And so if you're currently in the US with a status that corresponds to any of those categories, my advice is for you to stay in the US and try to extend your status. Because once you leave, you won't be able to get a new visa. And if you don't have a new visa, you won't qualify for the exception. If you're a healthcare worker or a researcher, you may be able to enter the United States through this exception. That exception has existed actually since mid-March with the first proclamation, but that's only if you're doing something that specifically assists the efforts that are being made by the US government to fight the pandemic. If you're working for a private healthcare related company, unless you can show that you will have an economic impact like any other NIE applicant, you may not qualify for this. The last thing to keep in mind is that consular law is very different than immigration law within the United States. So make sure that you're working with a professional, a US immigration attorney who has consular law experience and knows how to deal with each individual embassy and consulate in order to get an approval. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I can be reached at any time. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.